All right, so our next speakers are two brothers. So we're going to have a duo come up on stage to tell us how to do what you love in a communist country. Everyone give it up.
Thank you, sir. All right, thanks for having us here. We're Sergei and Vadim Revzin of the Mentors podcast, and one of our favorite things to do is tell underdog entrepreneurial stories. One of our favorite stories is that of our late father, Samuel Revzin, a man who built one of the most successful school systems in a communist country where entrepreneurship was illegal.
His story started with survival. When he was 1 year old, him and other families were running away from the Nazis in Soviet Belarus, and they hid in the woods. Well, my father started crying. He was 1 year old. The other families got scared. They kicked his family out. Moments later, when they were further away, they looked back and a bomb landed where they were.
He continued surviving as a young child. With the after effects of polio, he would miss sometimes months at a time of school. But he did have a chance to discover what he loved. In the Soviet summer camps, he was a camp counselor, and he realized that he loves teaching children.
So because of all the ailments and polio, he only had an 8th grade education, but he wanted to teach. Luckily, or somewhat luckily, there was a shortage of teachers after the war, and he started teaching vocational subjects like shop in a town 2 hours away from his hometown.
You have to understand something about a communist society. Because everything comes from a central authority, you're not supposed to go outside the lines, a lot of people end up doing just the bare minimum. But for our father, that didn't really make sense. He wanted to find interest in his work. So he took a different approach.
So he finally realized at the age of 28 that an 8th grade education was not going to get him where he wanted to be. So like Drew Barrymore, never been kissed, he went back to school and got a high school education and eventually, obviously, a college degree as well.
This ended up being a pivotal decision in his career. People started taking him more seriously. He was teaching multiple subjects, including history. He was starting to organize events, clubs, after-school activities for kids. And kind of like George and Wheezy, he was moving on up.
He apparently also took a cue from Michelle Pfeiffer in Dangerous Minds. There were underachieving kids in the area that were being ignored by the community. He started a dialogue with them, found out they just wanted to make things for their parents because they were poor. And so he created an after-school shop program for them, and they became his biggest allies.
Another example of a cool thing he did is he noticed that the city did not want to allocate budget to clean the neighborhoods around his school. So he created a competition for the school kids. He said whoever has the cleanest block in the neighborhood is going to win a prize. And they did end up having one of the cleanest blocks around where the school was.
So all this initiative taking did not go unnoticed. The Department of Education, when he was 42 years old, decided to promote him to actually start a school that had not yet been built and build that school from the ground up.
And apparently he took from the ground up, literally. He actually took the skills he developed as a vocational teacher and worked with the architects to redraw all of the blueprints. He literally worked with the construction workers on site, building from the ground up, because he wanted the school to be built exactly to his specifications.
He also innovated in the actual school itself. So one of the first schools to allow teachers to create their own curriculum, attaining some of the best talent in the Soviet Union. One of the first schools to allow students to take whatever subjects they were interested in, and pretty soon his students were winning math and science competitions all over the Soviet Union.
And so he had the communist ministers trying to bribe him to get their kids to go to his school, something that he never allowed. But this is a picture of him on a lecture circuit all over the Soviet Union. He would have education reformists and ministers, even from the United States, to come and learn about his model. So he was starting to get recognition.
Pretty soon, the press took notice. He was written up about. He had a few documentaries made about him that were syndicated across the Soviet Union. This is a screenshot from one of them. But as with anybody that attains any kind of prominence, there was negative people as well and sort of bad actors that started to take notice as well.
So something that he dealt with all of his life, even though he wasn't religious, was the institutionalized anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. And so he had to work harder than everybody else. There were actual quotas for how many Jews can be in certain posts. Despite that, he was able to succeed, but it was a difficult life.
Unfortunately, things took a turn further worse. When my dad was away on trips, we later found out the KGB would call my mother, and they would threaten her. There'd be death threats. There was an attempt made on our father's life when he was walking home from school one day, and it just got way too dangerous for our family to stay in Belarus.
So even though he was at the height of his career, we decided it was no longer safe to stay in the Soviet Union. So we had one of the quickest political asylum processes at that time in the early 90s. In about 6 months, we were on a plane to Boston.
September 26, 1994, our family came to America. Our father had zero English, didn't know the language at all. He was starting from scratch completely, but he had to do that for the family to keep us safe because sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same.
He started off pumping gas at 54-year-old PhD, pumping gas for $5 an hour. Within a year, he was able to save enough to buy a business from another Russian guy at a shopping mall, a cheap business, but he ended up growing it to multiple locations and ultimately helping put us through college.
Steve Jobs once said, "The only way to do great work is to love what you do."
And if our dad, this man who had everything going against him multiple times throughout his life, was able to accomplish this, then we certainly all owe it to ourselves to at least give it a shot.
Thank you, guys.